Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on from where in the world you are tuning in. I am Christina Strasburger, pronouns she and her, co-founder of the Queer Newark Oral History Project. And on behalf of the team, welcome to the first workshop of our first ever virtual oral history bootcamp. This event is made possible thanks to a grant by the New Jersey Council for the Humanities. We are delighted to see such a strong interest in the event and glad to have you with us today. We begin with a few virtual housekeeping notes before talking briefly about the project and our aims for these sessions. Closed captioning is enabled. Click on the live transcript or CC button on your screen to view the subtitles or the full transcript. This session is being recorded for our archive and will be made available on our website, queer.newark.rutgers.edu, and on our YouTube channel. Your microphone is muted. You will have the opportunity to unmute in the breakout sessions if you so choose. We will be monitoring the chat for questions and comments, so please feel free to respectfully engage in that space. We have posted some basic questions in the chat to capture more about who is sharing the space with us today. We will be live tweeting under our account at Queer Newark using the hashtag QNBootcamp. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Queer Newark Oral History Project, we are a community university partnership founded in the summer of 2011 by writer, scholar, activist Darnell Moore, Rutgers Newark historian Burl Satter, and me. We record interviews with LGBTQ+ people here in the city of Newark and make sure that their stories are documented and accessible to academic and community-based researchers, students, and any and everyone who wishes to learn more about the rich history of these communities. We host programming that bridges the community and campus and believe it's central to our mission to introduce people to the kinds of methodologies we're using in our project and to offer training to others interested in beginning their own oral history projects. We hope you'll be inspired and find ways to incorporate our oral histories and that of other projects in your research, educational spaces, and art. I thank the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for their financial support, but we must also acknowledge the support of our amazing community and university partners for their collaboration over the years. That includes the Newark LGBTQ Community Center, the Newark Public Library, Gallery of Faro, Newark Pride, the African American Office of Gay Concerns, as well as the financial support and encouragement of our Rutgers Chancellor's Office, who provided us with a seed grant to help build the project in our earlier days, the School of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office, and our colleagues at Dana Library, and of course, colleagues at the Federated Department of History. Before introducing our session and incredible facilitator, allow me to take a minute to shout out our Queer Newark team, whose dedication and passion for the work brought us here and continues to move us forward. Our fearless co-founder, Burl Satter, our wonderful co-directors, historians Whitney Strube and Timothy Stewart Winter, historian at home in Newark, traveling exhibit director and grant wizard, Mary Rizzo, our longest graduate researcher, podcast developer, and soon to be PhD, Kristen Scorsone, oral historian and master of the database, extraordinaire, Erica Fugger, social media manager and live tweeting phenom, Dominique Rocker. I would be remiss without acknowledging all the community members, our interns, our volunteers who have contributed their time and energy to sustaining and growing the project over this decade. Of course, we would not exist in the way that we do without the support of the communities that we serve. Some of the folks who have been interviewed by our team members are registered for these sessions. I would like to take a moment to thank you. Your stories need to be heard and preserved, and we so appreciate you trusting us to do it. Now, some of you may know that this is Transgender Awareness Week, a time leading up to the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which memorializes the victims of transphobic violence. We were intentional about scheduling the bootcamp this week because the T in LGBTQ is not silent. We acknowledge and honor all of our transgender people whose lives were lost this year and the years before to violence while trying to live their truth and to capture as many stories as possible. We remain grateful for the voices preserved in our archive, but we're also painfully aware that there are many we will never get to hear. We remember and we mourn Erica Morgan, trans Black woman and one of our youth generation panelists from our founding 2011 conference, who was murdered before we had an opportunity to capture her full life story. We invite you to listen to our interviews, especially those of our trans non-binary narrators like Erica Morgan and others, and consider being interviewed for the project and/or becoming an interviewer. We hope that's the case since you're all with us today. This morning's session, the first of 4, Introduction to Oral History, Planning an Oral History Project, is being facilitated by Maria Santiago. Maria is an independent oral historian and has been in practice since 2015. She also works at StoryCorps and special projects. Her interview experience is expansive and is focused on trauma, human rights, religious experience, and personal narratives. We are delighted that she is sharing her expertise here with us today. We invite you, this should be in the chat, to register for our other upcoming sessions on trauma-informed interviewing, the preservation and recording, which is extremely important, of oral histories, and putting oral history into action. Those are happening this afternoon and tomorrow morning and afternoon, respectively. So thank you once again, Maria. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christina. Muted there for a second. That was a beautiful introduction. Let me share my screen. So about me, I came into oral history in 2015. I was in the midst of a major life crisis, and I sort of fled to Indonesia in search of a person who I thought could help me learn how to live, frankly. And I brought along with me, a crappy Tascam. It must have been like a $50 recorder. I did have an iPhone. And I had a lot of time and a little bit of money, and I was able to I was able to find an interpreter that I got along with really well, and together we did a lot of traveling. And I was speaking to a lot of people, everybody I could possibly get to speak back to me, and they told me about interesting people who had exhibited the courage or the tenacity or just the openness that I really wanted to have in my life. And I went to speak to them, and everybody was just so incredibly open and kind to me. And I knew that there was something about having the microphone and being interested, genuinely interested, in fact, desperate for what they had to tell me and teach me. That was the reason why I was able to get so much out of it as I did. And so I was hooked on what I now know to be a form of oral history, a life history. Since then, I did a career change, and I got some training. So I got an MLIS, which is the degree that they ask you to have to become a librarian or an archivist. And I basically just studied oral history archives all the way through there. I went to Suzanne Snyder's Oral History Summer School, which Suzanne opened my eyes to so many things that oral history could be. And the style that she taught in that oral history summer school, those 2 weeks, I adopted a lot of that to be my style. And although our styles are not exactly the same, mine is certainly derivative of and after hers. I did a really influential internship at the Brooklyn Historical Society, where I did a lot of transcribing and listening to a great number of oral histories that had been done in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in Brooklyn, in different parts of Brooklyn. And the project was to sort of document different ethnicities as they moved into certain regions of Brooklyn and moved out, and what it was like to go through those transitions, or to be a person of that sort, if you will, at that time, at that place. I did an excellent, I did the Moth Community Storytelling workshop, it felt like 6 weeks, maybe it was just 4. And although storytelling and oral history are not the same thing, there is a great amount of overlap, and I learned a ton from there. I did Berkeley and Columbia. They have really excellent summer school programs that focus much more on very strict academic oral history. And although that's not exactly what I do, the things that a lot of the material I'm going to present today has come from what I learned there, because I think it's important, and it's it's a good idea to have formal instruction as part of the process of becoming the oral historian that you will become. And we will all be different ones, and we should be, because we're individuals, and the most important thing that we bring to any recording is who we are. I've done so many personal oral history projects. I just love to record and tape. And I would say that my style is humanist, for lack of a better term. I am not an academic. I'm not a historian. I'm not a journalist. I'm not an audio producer. Really, I'm a crafts person, and there's little bits of each of those threads in the work that I do as an oral historian. But it's, I bring my humanity, and I bring a great appreciation for who the other person is, and we talk and we tape it. That's how I would describe the type of oral history I do. And I will just state for the record that comments and beliefs here are my own. They're not that of StoryCorps. They're not necessarily that of StoryCorps. So I just want to make that distinction clear. Next slide. Thank you. So show of hands, I guess we can do virtual hands. So if you guys could chat, and maybe Kristen or Christina could speak out, let us know if you have been an interviewer in an oral history style recording, if you've been an interviewee, if you have a personal or professional or a passion project that you're using the session to do research on or for. Or if you've been hired to run a project and you're looking to figure out what you're going to do, because I get a lot of questions from those folks, or any other reasons that you have to be here. Let's just give it a couple minutes, or maybe just one, and I'll set my Pomodoro style timer here. And I guess I can actually look through the chat as well. So we have Georgia Marker saying, I'm hoping to do queer oral history in the future. We have Passion Project. We have, tons of responses coming in. We have done interview, never been an interviewee, more community interest than professional, been both, been a project leader, interviewer, never done oral history specifically, but I'm a qualitative researcher and I've done interview projects, preparing for an MA in public history, interviewer on a personal project, interviewer. I've been both. Okay, so there is a ton of experience. I see graduate students, professional. I see a question, what is an oral history style recording? I use that to be general. Once you get into the sort of oral history niche sphere, there are a lot of feelings about exactly what is oral history. There's sort of a very purist academic camp in which there tends to be very strict roles between the interviewer and the interviewee. And there's usually a great emphasis on making it as objective as possible, making it sort of strictly about the history, weaving in facts, making sure that it's about getting the facts. Because the hope for that recording is that it's going to go into an archive, or it's going to be referenced in a PhD dissertation, or a book of some sort. And so it's about specifically adding to the historical record. If you go to the very other end, you would have a StoryCorps style recording. I don't even know if StoryCorps calls it oral history anymore, but the idea is just that you have two people who already know each other, who are talking about their lives together. I don't mean that they're talking about their friendship, but they've come together into this professional recording booth, and they are making an effort to talk about something that is meaningful to them. And it usually is their relationship, but it could be a memorial of somebody, or discussing a specific time in their life, or an event, or absolutely anything that they want to memorialize and preserve. And then it's preserved at the Library of Congress. And so the history that is taken is not just the history of who these people are at this time in American history and oral history, but it's human history. It's what it's like, you know. There's so much meta about it that I could go on and on for days, but you see how people interact and what relationships are like and how people address each other. And, you know, one of the things that I would say is, if you ever want to be offended, you can listen to an oral history from the 70s, because, and I don't mean strictly the content. You'll hear slurs, you'll hear, you know, disrespect of all different sorts. And these are not people who are trying to be disrespectful. They're just being the way people were in the 70s, or the way they were in the 70s. And so I would call it sort of more unintentional. And then there's sort of everything in between, from strict rules. We don't know each other. I'm the interviewer. You're the interviewee. I ask you questions. You answer them. And it's all about truth, too. We're just two people talking, and the Library of Congress has taken it in. So I sort of mean the broad breadth of that, because I think in a lot of ways we're doing similar things. Okay, great. So I will thank you all for these really wonderful responses. It definitely, I like this, hoping to do clear oral history on funeral and mourning rites and rituals. Great, okay, so that is good context for me, and let's move on. Thank you. So why oral history? I do oral history because it is so human. And yeah, I just find that so profound. At the end of the day, an oral history interview it's just two people talking with a microphone, but the microphone gives you permission to go deeper, and that means opening up, and it means listening in. And when we share our lives in an environment of that interest and the care that goes into, that happens when you open up and you listen in, it creates a profound experience. And indulging in that experience can change you, it can leave you with wisdom, and it can magnify your own understanding of life. And that just feels so good. And it is, in my opinion, a profound way of experiencing and doing research on life, while getting great wisdom, and also just sharing a really human experience with somebody. And it's an experience that honors them, and it's an experience that tells them how important they are. And so I urge you to lean into the so human aspect, and know that anyone can do this, because we're all humans. Next slide. So today's session, we're going to do about 2 more hours. We're going to do modulating between demystifying oral history, getting familiar with interviewing, and fundamentals of project design. Now, why do we get familiar with interviewing? The reason that I have sort of interspersed a few short, I think 6 or 7 minute question breakout sessions where you're going to be with one other person, is because it's vitally important to remember and re-remember what it's like to sit in these different roles. Because when you're planning a project or you're being an interviewer, it really helps to know what it's like to have been the interviewee. And what is it like? Well, you're vulnerable. You are definitely vulnerable. So you don't know necessarily what they're going to ask you. And then what do you say, right? Any good question is going to have a multitude of possible responses. And on the spot, with a camera or with a microphone in front of their face, being recorded for posterity, this person has to respond to that question in a way that is truthful, is, you know, going to offend as few people as possible, maybe protect a few people from truths. Maybe there's some white lies in there. That's just a fact that comes up in oral history. Is there's a wide range of way to answer most questions, and that person has to figure out how they can sort of be truthful but also respectful of the environment that they're living in. And that's a tough thing to do. I mean, just think about, you know, what you do when you're small talking, and then think about doing that with, you know, probably somebody who's a stranger with a microphone in front of you. So it's important to be respectful of that and have compassion for what you're asking them to do. But also, you do want to respect the fact that they agreed to be there. They're not going in there blind. Hopefully you should have spoken about what you're going to be doing beforehand and the subject matter. And so you want to make sure that you're modulating between being compassionate and respectful and also serving the purpose of the interview, which is to actually get these responses. Other interferences with being the interviewee. Historical gravity. You're saying something today, you don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. Is this person going to change from foe to friend? Are they going to change from friend to foe? Are you revealing something about yourself that, you know, in the future you might not want to have out there, etc. There's a sense that if I say this because it's on tape, that the people are going to think that this is the one definite truth that I have to say about this, and this is the defining truth. And that's just not always true. It's sometimes true. It's not always true. And so that's a thing that the interviewee has to go through. They are afraid of leaving something important out. That's just because you're in this rather artificial environment, having a deep experience, and you might just, you know, be having a bit of a one-track mind and forgetting something. And so these are little things that make you anxious or nervous to be in that seat. You have adrenaline, and you know, you might have cotton mouth or stuttering or whatever else happens when you're feeling nervous. But at the same time that you're in that chair, you have this hope to be seen, to be understood, you know, to leave an audio record of your voice, your beliefs, your life. And so that's a bit about what it's like to be the interviewee. It's also hard to be the interviewer, right? So you have the potential interferences would be, I am the interviewer, I'm the person with the recording device. It's my job to create this historical record. I got to manage the mood. I have to cover every possible topic. What do I ask? What if they don't open up and it's super duper awkward and the answers don't happen? On the other hand, you could be afraid of over interfering and micromanaging it, and that doesn't sound great in retrospect either. You don't know what's going to happen. You know, you're aware that this could go very wrong if you push too hard in one direction. You know, a person could say, I don't like this, and get up and walk out. And you're always nervous about the boundaries that the other person has either set explicitly or is sort of given you via vibe during the interview. And so there's a lot for you to manage there. And yet when you're in that seat, your hope is to help paint the portrait. So you are, you know, the blank tape is arguably the canvas, and you're creating the space, and you are, you know, sort of facilitating this person making an audio portrait of themselves or the subject matter that you're talking about. And that's a really profound and, I'd say, cool thing. Your hope is to understand and also to be somehow changed by this. You know, anytime you learn something new, you are changed. And if you are doing a good interview and you are doing a great job of listening, you should be changed by it because you should have learned something. And then we have the peer relation. This is sort of more of a StoryCorps style interview. And you still have potential, like, even though it's you and your buddy or you and your mother or somebody that you love, there's still interference. Like, you know, who's supposed to do what? Or is there going to be somebody's asking questions, somebody's answering questions? Are we just talking and there's a tape here? You know, am I allowed to laugh? Am I allowed to cry? What if we disagree? What if we have a deep disagreement on the facts of the case or why somebody's motivation, why they did this? Do we talk it through? Do I go with their side just to be agreeable? Do we have to have a list of questions? A lot of people say, I'm not good at telling stories. I don't have anything worth sharing. Do I have to talk? I don't have a story. And that is generally not true. And there's, you know, you guys all have a ton of experience. You know, you've heard plenty of these stories. The person says, I don't have anything to say. And, you know, 3 hours later, you're gobsmacked and your jaw's on the floor. But the hope, you know, often in that peer relation interview is to leave a record of your relationship with that loved one, how you talk together, your stories, your relationship, what it was like to be alive together. And again, the reason that we're going to be doing a number of these short interview breakout sessions is so that we can experience what it's like to be the interviewee and the interviewer, so that we can bring that compassion, that knowledge into our practice And whenever we're asking somebody to be an interviewee, we are well aware of what that is like. Next slide, please. And then we're going to talk about fundamentals of project design. So I've broken this out into 5 rough phases. Phase 1 is concept, audience, and scope, ideating them. Phase 2 is ideating your participants, your interview outline, and your broad plan. Then phase 3 is prepping to do the interview and actually doing the interview. Phase 4 is after the interview, meaning immediately after the interview. And then phase 5 is the interview's afterlife. Next slide. So the agenda, the time frames on the left are a little bit messed up at this point, but we are heading through. So we've done orientation, and now we're going to do interview exercise 1. And before we step into it, I do want to make this a shared interactive experience. So since y'all are muted, just feel free to please pop in a question, comment, share an experience, or reflect. And Kristen will be reading these, and will jump in at any point if there's something that is a good idea to stop and reflect on. Okay, so Kristen is now going to break you out into groups of 2. So we're mimicking a very common oral history pairing. And it's going to be for 6 minutes. I will use my precise timer on that. And the idea is that you're going to choose one of these questions, and one person is going to ask and the other person is going to respond. You don't have to both respond to the same question. But let's get started. And I want to give credit. I got this from StoryCorps.org's Great Questions list. So let's get started.
You should be seeing the room pop up. Please accept that invitation. Oh, okay. If you cannot participate in the breakout, that's no problem. Thank you. We'll enjoy you for as long as you're able to be here. And if there's anyone that we see that's not in a room, we'll come with you.
So I'm placing 6 minutes on my timer, so you should each have about 3 minutes to respond.
Maria, can you put the list of questions in the chat so that everyone can see them?
Great idea. Here you go.
What are you proudest of? Anyway, we can get all 3 of them in one actual message instead of broken out. Let me see if I can get it for them.
Here, yes, let me do that.
Are the folks with us not able to join a breakout session, or were you joining us a little late and would like to be placed into a breakout session?
Tyler needs to be placed in another. Tina needs to go back in with Lola.
Let's see if we can make that happen. Oh, no problem. We appreciate that one. So Tyler is not joined. So we need a space that we could have two. So Tyler has not joined the room. Okay. I was in group 13. Okay. Not able to participate. Okay. I'm sorry. Just one more time, if we can say group 20. Catherine was in group 20. Okay. So let's move Tyler to group 20. And we should have two. And who else are we? No, I joined room 13, but I was there long. Yeah.
I think it's
I've been there, Tyler. So do we have Catherine? So it says not joined. Catherine says you did not join group 20 when you were in there. Was there? Do we have anyone else that's not?
I think it was maybe Tina and Lola were the only other two.
Okay.
Well, we are, I hate to say it, we are out of the 6 minutes. So I think that there's going to be a number of additional breakout groups. So perhaps we can, move on. Okay. Sorry about that, Tyler. Okay. So I'm interested just for a couple minutes. I'd love to see from people who were the interviewee what that felt like. Just let's see if we can throw some thoughts into the chat. Oh, sorry to hear that, Jesse. Okay, let's open the floor. Does anybody have any thoughts on what that was like? One of the things that always strikes me when I do an exercise like this is some of the questions can seem quite topical and even small talky, but when asked in a one-on-one scenario, you obviously have the choice to make it light or to take it deep. And it feels very vulnerable, but it's also fun. And that is one of the reasons that we do it.
Maria, hold on 1 second. Let us give everyone a chance to come back from the breakout rooms.
Oh,
yeah, it
great.
takes the 1 minute to close. And then hopefully
Okay.
the second time, it will be a little bit more obvious who is able to join and who is not for the breakout sessions. Yeah. Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, we saw that. Oh, one accidentally clicked leave breakout room. We get it. I mean, one of the things that we had to transition so much when we moved, online for the pandemic was using all of these technologies and trying to figure out how to record our interviews in these kinds of ways. So we appreciate your patience with us for this morning. I think we're getting our folks back in the space. And great. Okay. So everyone should be getting back. There we go. There's our numbers coming back up. I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, let me know when I'm not seeing the numbers, so let me know when we think it's safe to move on.
Okay. So the participants right back, I think we may have maybe lost a couple, so please feel free to restart. And then the next one, that should be a lot smoother.
Okay, sounds good. So let us move along. Okay, so at this point, if we could switch back to the PowerPoint presentation, I will note that it is about 12:20, and we have a ton of the actual meat and potatoes of this to go through. And what I will warn you is that this is gonna, from a visual perspective, this is about to get very text heavy. But I will read it. Some people enjoy hearing it. Some people enjoy reading it. It's a great time to, again, insert questions, comments into the chat. Otherwise, it will come out from me as a monologue. I think that's okay because we will have plenty of time to sort of go through discussion with this. So next slide, please. Next. And apologize, you might be able to hear my puppy in the background. And the next slide, please. Okay, phase one. So this is an excerpt from Mary Marshall Clark, who runs the Columbia University Center for Oral History, CCOHR, who is a very well-known expert on the subject. But I always find this a very good way of putting it. The goal of a good oral history project design is to move the individual narrator back and forth from the individual or personal story to the collective or historical story. An ideal project design integrates the broad historical timeline of an institution, community, or social movement with individual life histories. This ability on the part of the interviewer opens up the individual narrator to become both a historical subject in his or her own right, as well as to invite that narrator to bear witness to the larger events and the social, cultural, and political worlds to which they belong. I don't have a ton to add to that. I think it's very eloquent, and it's true. It requires some mastery to be able to do this eloquently, and some practice. But I have one person that I know who did it really well was I did when I was early on, and I interned on the African American AIDS Activism Oral History Project for Dr. Dan Royals. It was his dissertation project when he was at Temple. And he had activists talking about the time that, the work that they did as activists in the 80s, mostly with Black people, and what it was like for them to be a Black person, or in some cases a white person involved in that collective action, and then what it was like to be part of the group of people who were engaged in that struggle, and then what it was like to just be an American at that time. And that movement from who they are as individual people and their early life experiences, plenty of time spent in their childhood and formative period of their life, and then moving them to how they got into activism and what caused them to care so deeply about this particular topic, to their reflections as adult humans who were going through this sort of on a more meta level, was really profound and very well done. And it really helped me as somebody who was just experiencing these oral histories, as somebody who was processing them, to gain a really, I felt that I was in the middle of an incredible documentary. So just wanted to put that out there. Now, the first thing that you're going to do, thank you, as when you're planning your project is to make a project blueprint. Now, you're going to define the mission and the purpose of the project as a whole, which is why it's important. What is the nature of the historical material that's going to be generated? Is it to go into a university archive? Is it going to go into a community organization's archive? Is it going to be Sometimes, oftentimes it's not necessarily for historical purposes. It's because there's production value, right? You want to be able to take these oral histories and have an audio producer cut them into, 30 second to 3 minute clips that you might use for a funding rally. But just being clear about what is the purpose, what is the end game for these recordings. Establish the general time frame of the memories you want to capture. So this could be, an epidemic in the 80s. This could be a person's entire life history, which could span, 10 to 100 years. And the longer the time frame, obviously, the more subcategories or periods or eras within that period would be valid subject matter to explore. However, you can take a very short period of time with, a sufficient amount of intensity, interpersonal, political, whatever intensity, and you can continue zooming into that, and you'll have eras within or periods within that 6-month period. Even think about a mourning period. You're going to go through the 5 stages. They're going to be overlapping. Some of them are going to recur twice. So just really think about the time frame that you're covering and what are all the subgroups of time periods or layers within that, and make an effort to cover that. Break down the topics that are going to be covered in relation to these timeframes and the events, and establish how the general historical story and these individual life stories change over that period of time. And again, that period doesn't have to be a very long time for there to be change. And there are many, a story has an arc. And again, life history, oral history is not. You're not necessarily searching for a story. But if you are doing a life history, there generally will be an arc that happens in that period. And when you can find that, I encourage you to, because it's usually profound. So the next thing we're going to do, next slide, is ideation of concept. So what is the goal? Do you have a thesis, or do you have a question? Is there a thing that you're trying to learn? Getting as specific as you can into that is going to benefit you, because you're going to do less rambling when you're actually doing the interview, which means that during that interview, you're going to have higher value content, just to be frank. And I'm not going to, I wouldn't overgeneralize that too much. I have done so many recordings that I found very personally valuable, that are just me exploring a topic with somebody who knows significantly more about it than me, or just talking about life. And it is rather meandering. And I wouldn't necessarily say that particular recording is going to be the one that gets produced, or that is the particular recording that really ought to be in the archive. But doing that is an act of research in and of itself. And I always think of it as sort of being like a musician. If you were a really good musician and perhaps paid to do it for a living, and you need to find riffs, or you need to make songs, you're going to be recording yourself while you jam, because things are just going to come up. And instead of having to write them all down, it's nice to just be able to capture the whole experience of jamming. Which ideas or questions are central to your project? What has to be answered, and what's periphery? Again, in a good project design, and let's just presume for a second that you don't have a ton of time to be sort of meandering and figuring it out, which is very luxurious, and take it if you can. But if you can't, your job is to get to the nugget or the kernel of what this thing is about as soon as possible. And so that means writing down the hard questions of, or making the strong statements of, this is about this, it's not about this. If it's about this, what are the questions I want people to answer? And you don't have, and I would almost almost always say be as direct as possible, because a direct question will get a direct answer oftentimes, or it's more easy oftentimes to get a direct answer if you ask a direct question. I wouldn't overgeneralize that. There are definitely times, and your skill as a practitioner will help you learn with this particular person, do I want to be more oblique or do I want to be more direct? But my personal style is to, I prioritize transparency, because I would also rather somebody say, I'm not able to talk about that, or I wouldn't frame it that way, than to sort of turn everything into a psycho game. But again, everybody has their different styles, and I've seen some very deft players sort of doing a 3D chess situation. It's just not my personal style. What period of time will be discussed? What interview format best represents your plan? So is this going to be a life history, oral history, where you're speaking about their entire history? You're hoping to find some sort of arc or some sort of narrative thread that kind of helps you to encapsulate or sum up their life, the wisdom they learned, the challenges they overcame, what control they had, what agency they did not have over their lives, what was thrown at them, etc. You might be looking at a focused history interview where it's less about the individual person and more about the event or the time period or the era, or the organization, or, etc. At which point, in which case your questions are going to be more focused on that thing rather than the individual, but you will always pay heed to the actual interview you're speaking with, because what they bring to it reflects on their view of what they went through or what it was like for them to be there, etc. And in order to understand the thing, you have to understand the viewpoints of the people who were there, and so you have to understand about the people who were there as they identify themselves. What memories, anecdotes, stories, jokes do you hope to evoke? With a personal life history, you can find those out by talking to people who knew that person. Just to like make an example, you're doing an oral history for somebody's retirement party. You're going to do a few interviews with them. You're going to have an audio producer turn it into a 10-minute piece that everybody's going to listen to. You would talk to people who you would talk to their best friend. You would talk to their boss. You would speak to subordinates, their colleagues, etc. And they're going to tell you jokes and things to ask about, and you'll ask that person. With an organizational history or an era in time, it's sometimes arguably easier. You can go through the history, you can go through newspapers, you can go through blogs, etc. Talk to people who were there. But having a general sense of the time frame, a general sense of the major things that happened, and then weaving in specific jokes, stories, anecdotes, memories, to dot that oral history, that audio record, makes it very powerful, because when you're listening to it, it's very nice to have the context, but it's sort of it's a hazy picture. The thing that really helps you understand what was going on from that person's point of view or in that person's life is almost always going to be that specific memory, that specific instance that has the tell of who that person was and how they interacted with this time frame that they were in. And then also asking what views, frames of mind, motivations, personal narratives do you hope to uncover? Generally speaking, there's going to be a bunch of these. And people are going to have conflicting memories. They are going to have conflicting motivations. They're also going to have genuinely different experiences about what it was like to be there at that time. And that is because we are not all treated the same, and we are not all treated the same for different reasons. We have different amounts of power and status, etc. And so if you want your documentation to be thorough and comprehensive, you will seek out different groups of people and different representations and hear for them, because the truth of the historical record will never be just one or two people's idea of what happened. Next slide, please. So you can continue doing research. You can, read books and articles, interview people on background. Okay, so if you are unfamiliar with your subject matter, hang out in those communities. Generally speaking, we don't often do these, but I definitely know people get hired to do oral history projects on subject matters that they are not familiar in. So as you can, educate yourself. Has anybody done a similar project? If so, how would you like yours to be, similar or different? and then just sort of chart out all of the important things. So, if it were a life history, but you can do this also for an organization's history or the history of a movement or an era, date of birth, important historical events with the person's age at that time, important family events, academic and career events, friend events, and then stuff that only friends and family would know. Next slide. Next, we're thinking about audience and intention. Who is your audience? And that is, who are the people who are going to be consuming these oral histories? Is it PhD students? Is it members of the community? Is it people 30, 50 years more hence who you just want them to know what it was like to be alive at this point in time? What experience do you hope that the final product will leave them with? This is something that is very hard to engineer unless you're a producer or you have very specific questions. And remember, whatever questions you have, you can't control the responses. And if it's a true oral history, it's going to be a raw piece of audio that you are not necessarily redacting. And I know there's a huge debate about whether or not you redact. I sort of feel okay with it as long as it's annotated. But let's not get into that. What hard goals or soft goals are most likely to create this desired effect? And I have a list of hard and soft goals later. And then what period of time will your work be active or publicly visible? So a lot of times your work will, you do the interview, you process it, and then it's up, the next week, and you have no plan to take it down. Some people require a moratorium and they don't want it to be, made available for 20 years. We can get into that later. I would say that's very tricky and sticky because you don't know where you're going to be in that period of time. Yeah, let's move on. What time and financial resources do you have to make this happen? How many voices, narrators, or experiences do you hope to include? What budget do you have? Often it's going to be pretty darn close to zero. So figuring out how you can work within that to realize your dream. And then what is the time period you're going to be executing this project? Next slide. And then we are also going to remember to fold in an understanding of accessibility. There's a digital divide. A lot of people, since the pandemic have migrated to sometimes a primarily digital way of life, but that doesn't mean that everybody can do a Zoom recording with you. That doesn't mean everybody has high-speed internet or knows how to use Zoom, etc. There are sensory impairments. There are other constraints, mobility, scheduling, geography, equipment, etc. There are potential legal and ethical hazards. So, I was thrilled to find that you have a session on trauma recording or trauma interviewing. You want to make sure that people are emotionally and physically safe, that you are not making yourself legally liable, and that you are using release forms and going through the whole informed consent process. And then obviously professional codes of ethics, including IRBs, etc. Next. So let's do interview exercise number 2. We have a few different, actually, you know what, let's take a quick second. In the chat, are there any questions?
No questions so far.
Okay, great. So let's move into, Tyler Musgrave. I don't think you're able to unmute.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much. Sorry, you just sprung this idea about the IRB process. I'm a student right now. Yeah, so is there certain types of interviews, for example, would that be something we would have to do just generally to go through the IRB process to like facilitate an oral history project within, I mean, it's a personal community of mine, it's a diaspora community of mine that I'm doing it in, or does it really just depend? Sorry, you just like made me think about that. And I was like, wow, okay, I didn't even think that would be something I needed to do. But what kind of qualifies, or like, what are the needs of the IRB, if that, you know, if that makes sense? Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for asking. To my understanding, IRBs are only for academic institutions, or it might involve, a medical institution or organization. If there, I think it stands for Institutional Review Board. So if there is no institutional review, then I don't believe that you would be subject to that. I believe that one of the gifts and one of the liabilities of a community oral history project is you're going to have less oversight. And so the oversight really becomes what you are comfortable with. We're going to get into one of the, and so, you want to, protect yourself. Yeah, you want to protect yourself. You also want to protect your participants. And, at StoryCorps, we follow the Hippocratic Oath. So first, no harm. And I really recommend that. Later on in the next section, I believe it is, we're going to talk about how you can do a pre-interview where you will be notifying frankly, it's just a conversation with you and your participants, talking about what you're going to cover topic-wise, asking them, is there anything that you don't want to talk about? You can have a safe word, but just making sure that they enter that room fully informed about the period of time you're going to talk about, like broad subjects you're going to talk about. They have a chance to say, don't ask me about this, don't ask me about that. And I really think that by following that and really sticking to that as an ethical guideline between the two of you, you're going to be safe. Okay, so let's do breakout rooms. I'm going to chat about the exercise. Can you tell us how much time? Yes, it's 6 minutes. I apologize. I thought I had said that. I'm going to start my timer at 6 minutes, starting with after I type in these interview questions.
Thank you, Jesse, for adding that in the chat. If you are a student and are planning to use your interviews for academic work, you will need to contact the Institutional Review Board at your school. We have one now. Our project is under the IRB, and there is a common rule for some projects, and oral history is covered under there, that would have exemption, but definitely check with your institution to make sure you follow protocol.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to pop these in here.
I think what might be helpful is that we will give you a 3-minute warning in the breakout room when it's time to switch. Because we didn't, in case you're like us, not keeping time with so many things. Are we ready to break out?
Yep, and
Okay.
I'm starting the 6-minute timer.
Starting a timer, okay. Okay, everyone, if you're in a room that someone else does not join, because we set these up automatically, please let us know and we will do our best to make sure you are paired up. And here we go. Put those questions in the chat again. Okay, so we have some folks who chose not to join their rooms, which is fine. I think we have everyone, couple except one. Kristen, I'm gonna move you into room 5 if you can. So everyone will hopefully be able to do the exercise. Okay. Okay. Dominique, I'm gonna move you to room 2. Okay, so you can participate in the exercise. Okay. Ray, how are we doing on time? So I could broadcast a message because some are just getting into their rooms. You'll just let me know when they should switch, right? They all have the questions. And so you built up a break, right? Is that the next slide is a break? So we do have a little bit more time. You're muted.
Yes, if folks want to use that to continue their conversations, they are welcome to. I just want to
Okay,
make sure.
cool. I'll broadcast that message because only the folks that are with us would have heard that.
Great.
So if you choose. Broadcast.
We have about a 1-minute warning. Yep.
I just messaged them to say, make sure to switch if they haven't, because some came in late, and then and just announcing the 5-minute break so that they could take a little extra time. So if you want to type a message or when you're ready, I'll just say we're on 5-minute break and we'll resume.
Yep, I'll do that right now. I'll
Okay.
say,
Whatever time you want.
let's say, well, let's just make it a round number. Let's say resume at 1 so that people have enough time to finish.
I love round numbers. We'll reconvene in the main room at
So I'm going to stop my video.
absolutely.
History projects end up going on for years and years. Okay,
Maria.
next slide.
Maria,
Yes.
we have a question in the chat regarding interviewing process, like the act of asking questions and crafting questions. So Carrie wants to know, like regarding the format for questions, they each took a turn asking the other all the questions one after another. They felt the way that the questions were, they didn't seem open-ended. And so they were curious to see if the goal was just a question and answer, or if the goal was something else. And I don't know, like, how do you conduct like your questions? Do you have a list? And how, do you stick with it, or do you jump around, or how do you craft your questions? I feel like is the crux of the question here.
Oh, okay. So I see. I'm looking at the I'm looking at the question right now from Carrie. So with the questions from the interview exercise, I think the idea was just actually to go from one question each. So you answer for about 3 minutes, and then the other person answers for about 3 minutes, another question. Apologies if that was not clear. In terms of open-ended, closed, I'm reviewing this. I suppose, do you remember your first date? Have you served in the armed? Yes, I can see that there are some closed questions here. I guess the idea is that the person would so if I were the interviewer and I would say, do you remember your first date? And the other person says yes, what you do is you wait, and you give them at least 4 really good long seconds. And if they don't expand, you can ask them to expand upon it. And you can also take it as a sign that they are not interested in expanding upon that. We do go into questions later on in this, but I guess apologies, Carrie. I thought I had said at the beginning, just choose one question. Okay, so let's. I'm seeing some. Let's see. It's I think like truly the purpose of the questions was really to put you in the seat of being the interviewer and the interviewee, and to have the experience of being sort of put on the spot of somebody's asking you this question, and I don't know this person necessarily, and I'm feeling the weight of being of having to respond, and to know that somebody is listening to my response, and just to sort of imagine what it would be like to have a microphone in front of you, and to know that that experience is going to be like the way you respond, your response to that question is on the record, and it's on the historical record, and it's something that you're going to have a copy of, and most likely they're going to have a copy of. And so the purpose was not to get the questions answered. The question was just to be in that space where you are either doing the questioning or doing the answering, so that you can just keep that in mind, what that feels like when you are when you're asking other people to be in that spot.
We have a person with their hand raised that has a question.
Yes, please.
They'll be unmuting.
I think my question was related to what we're talking about. In that I wasn't sure, is the purpose for us to feel a little bit uncomfortable so that we know what that feels like for the participant, or because I felt like some of the questions, like the one about the first date, for instance, I felt like that might be like an uncomfortable question depending on like, who the other person is and like their background, or like some of the other questions. So I guess I wasn't sure if that was the intent, or thinking about which questions are we posing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean, welcome to oral history. People ask you questions that feel uncomfortable. I guess what I had imagined was that part of the exercise would be 2 people who are in a room. You don't know each other. You have a list of questions. You've been instructed to ask one of each other, and you decide which you want to ask. And if you weren't comfortable talking about your first date, that's a time for you to say, I'm not comfortable with that. Or if you're the person who is asking that and you feel like it might be uncomfortable, you would say, are you comfortable doing that? You know, it's sort of a form of consent, and also advocating for yourself and your what you're comfortable with. And that is absolutely part of the oral history process. The other thing is that sometimes questions do come out, and it's not comfortable, and you say, you know, I'll take a pass on that. But definitely, I don't think that you can be genuinely part of the oral history process if you are not prepared to be in a situation where you are uncomfortable, or you might inadvertently make the other person uncomfortable. And that's just because it's human inquiry. That's my take. I'm actually interested to hear what you all think about that. But I think that is what makes it scary. It's what makes it thrilling.
If I might say something, like for Queer Newark, I think this it's interesting, these questions that are rising from the folks in the chat about these questions, because like for Queer Newark, we have sets of questions that we go through. And I found that and sometimes they don't all relate, you know, like where these questions, some of them were about first date versus armed forces, right? So you have to think like, does it make sense in the moment to go through these questions one by one, or take a more, I guess, like holistic approach of like, I know I want to hit all these questions, but I'm going to follow the lead of the interviewee. And if someone isn't going to answer a question, you can, if you sense discomfort, you could say like, you know, do you want us to pause this interview? Or are you uncomfortable? We can take this part out. And sometimes I've noticed it's just my uncomfortability, and I've avoided asking, say something, you know, regarding someone's romantic life, that then in the end, when I say, do you have any more questions? They're like, yeah, I want to talk about sex. And you're like, oh, okay, all right, cool. Let's get into it then. And it's just me being, you know, too nervous, you know, and self-censoring. So I think, yeah, I think like what's this comment here? I think there's a lot that can be set up by the sequence of the questions and how it is asked or framed. I totally agree. It's sort of like you're following this person down a path, and you know, maybe they want to go somewhere else, and you follow them. If they get too far down the road and they go into a whole other town or state, then you got to bring them back. But yeah, I think it's really cool. The fact that these questions were set up in this way to generate this sort of like, you know, trying to figure out the process of this and what feels right and what doesn't.
Is this Carrie I'm speaking to?
Oh, Kristen.
Kristen. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, so yes, I mean, it is doing oral history, unless you're going to be, and I really don't recommend this. It's good for beginners, but I don't recommend it once you're beyond that beginner phase. You have like a straight list of like, say, 10 or 15 questions that you want to get through. And by the way, 15 questions would take a very long time to get through, much more than an hour. You can usually get through about 4 in an hour, in my experience, 4 or 5. You can take the tact of, I'm going to ask these questions, but really the beauty of oral history is that it's totally extemporaneous. And the point of the guide, the interview guide, is to, as you said, if I ask them a question and we end up in Kathmandu, I need to bring them back to where we are at some point. But watching them go from here to there, and all of the sort of connections that they're making in their brain, is absolutely what oral history is about. And you don't want to cut that off. You want to go there with them, because otherwise, just send them an email and ask them to answer the questions, right? And you'll receive an edited response that is, you know, very cut and dry to what you ask them to respond to. And that everybody's doing free association, and they are doing free association. So the thing that Suzanne Snyder taught me and taught us, and again, I recommend that anybody who's really interested in this do oral history summer school. Her name is Suzanne Snyder. is that anything anybody says is in, like, if somebody responds and they talk about their cat, their brother, and the lampshade that sits on their desk, you're allowed to talk about the cat, their brother, and the lampshade on their desk. You're not necessarily allowed to ask about their mother, right? So they are painting, as they talk, they're painting the boundaries of what you're allowed to talk to them or ask them follow-up questions on. And that way, they're always sort of in control of the interview. And of course, if they mention their brother and then they don't want to talk, they can always say, I'm not comfortable talking about that. Boundary accepted, move on. But yeah, that is the beauty, and figuring out, let's just say that you have to ask these 10 questions for whatever reason, figuring out how to insert them into the conversation is an act of improvisation, because you want to get not just the short answer to the question, you want to get the full answer to the question. That is what you can do in oral history that you really can't do in other forms of documentation. And so yeah, you will hold off on question number 2 until 10 minutes later, and maybe you'll skip to question number 6 before you get to question number 2. But it's all part of the art of being an interviewer. I also wanted to, so Michelle Schwartz said, I tried asking follow-up questions rather than letting them sit in silence. This was the most impactful thing that I've learned in my training as an oral historian, is you actually, and it's given me the best results. Somebody answers a question, particularly if you feel that slightly dissatisfied by their answer, or that it didn't live up to your expectations of maybe truthfulness or fulsomeness or whatever, you want them to sit for a minimum of 4 seconds in silence before you ask that follow-up question. And the reason is that most people, if there's anything left inside of them that they're willing to share, if you force them to listen, to sit in that silence, it will just come out of them. And if you just sit in silence and you're listening, you're honestly, a lot of people will just kind of not stop talking. And so you will at that point wait until you feel that the question has been fully answered, and then wait for a break. And then you start to sort of traipse back to your interview blueprint that you wrote. And as somebody who's listened to many, many interviews and who has been an interviewer many times, those 4 seconds can feel totally excruciating. It feels weird, it's uncomfortable, it's very weird and uncomfortable if they're also just staring at you. You need to learn how to deal with that. When you listen to the tape, it does not feel like a long time at all. And in fact, if you start asking follow-up questions prior to that, it sounds premature. And as the listener, you want to hear them sit in silence. And it's sort of, it could be an act of defiance. I'm not telling you anymore. It could be a statement that there's no more to tell. But oftentimes they will keep talking until it's all out of them. And one of your jobs as the interviewer is to get it all out of them. Let's see. Thank you, LaTanya. Thank you. It is dance. It's very much a dance, like any other conversation. And the stakes feel heightened, and they are, right? Because it's on tape. You do get better over time. It's uncomfortable at first, but thank you so much. I know that I would never ever make public the first interviews I did, like for maybe the first year or so, because I was awkward and gosh, maybe you could even say combative, and just trying to understand so bad that I was trying to understand more than I was trying to listen. And when you are able to, for me, that was a big arc in my maturity as an interviewer, to move from like wanting to forcibly understand to listening, and gosh, you get so much out of listening. And that was sort of part of what we wanted to do with this exercise as well, was to move, to give people a place in which to just listen for 3 minutes. And I know that it sounds maybe trite or stupid or silly, but I don't know that in general we're often active listening to somebody for 3 minutes, just like I don't know if anybody's done meditation exercises. It can be pretty darn hard to quiet your mind and just try not to think, or just let the thoughts pass like clouds for 3 minutes. But as the interviewer in oral history, what you should be doing is actively listening. Okay, let's move on. It's 1:23. I'm going to sort of breeze through. I'm sharing this link because there is a lot of text here. What I'm going to start doing at this point is just kind of summarizing the text on the pages, but you guys have this, the link to this, so you don't have to take notes. You can just sit back. And again, I love the questions, the comments, because they really get to what you want to learn, and I could talk about this all day. So, okay, let me see which slide we're on. Gatekeepers. Okay, so yeah, gatekeepers, advisory councils. If there are people who know people like a respected group, get with those people, pitch them your project, try to get their buy-in. They'll help you out, hopefully. Now, let's see. So this is actually an important part of the project design. How, like, your pairings and the format in which people are doing these interviews. So free association or portrait of a character applies to a life history. You're talking to them, you have your list of, like, you remember you made your blueprint, so you have the time period, you have all the things, the historical eras, the important things that were going on, then you have their life, their personal life plotted over that. And so that's kind of the stuff that you want to talk about. Another one, and that is, you don't necessarily know them. You could, but you don't necessarily know them. Then you have dialogue or shared knowledge, peer-to-peer, family or intergenerational. This is where you have two people who are sort of validating and corroborating a thing that they experienced. The thing that they experienced could be their, family life. It could be an event that they were both party to, good or bad, but they're talking about what it was like to witness that or to be part of that. Then you have this traditional hard questions based. Oh, sorry, I'm on the next slide. So this would be like an academic or a scholarly oral history. You could also think of it as journalistic, 60 Minutes or Terry Gross, or interviewing the expert. That is going to be about as hard as they come in terms of having a hard set of questions. Typically, the interviewer is also in and of themselves an expert, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to necessarily follow all of the nuances of what the other person is dropping content-wise. And then we have some ethnographic style. I'm not an expert on this, but I know that they tend to be longitudinal, fewer participants, but you'd be interviewing them over time. At different intervals that are that relate to what you're studying. Next slide, please. So remember that the information revealed in an oral history interview transcends the content of what is spoken. The interpersonal dynamic expresses so much information that isn't necessarily conveyed in an obvious way during the interview if you were just looking at the transcript. This information can be interpreted personally, sociologically, culturally. And by playing with different narrator pairings, like we just spoke, you may wish to evoke this subconscious information. So for instance, a parent or child pairing might discuss major conflict or rift or discord in their relationship, but they might use a lot of shared language that indicates how close they actually are. Or maybe the way that person one defines what it means to be an American may differ when they speak to somebody from a different country, or somebody who is very different from them, within the United States, or a veteran. Person one may not make overtly racist or sexist or otherwise bigoted comments, no matter who they speak to. However, if you get that person speaking to multiple different types of people, you might see that they actually treat these different people differently, in different levels of overt ways, or even, benevolently, whatever ways. You can all capture that with oral history, which I love. Now, thanks. Now we are on the matrix model. The matrix model, high level, is just, you have this thing that you're trying to document, and you know that there are different classes of people, categories of people, etc. So you just make a matrix of all of the different sort of permutations or combobulations of classes and types of people and you know, different identities. And you make a matrix and you just try to check as many boxes as you can. Or knowing that you can't check every single box, just making sure that you don't have all of your checks in one portion, right? Like ideally they would at least be fanned out and you would have representation across the matrix. Next slide, please. I think that the matrix model is very idealistic, and I have used it, and I recommend always going through that exercise, but also recognize that a lot of your participants and the people who actually agree to do the interview with you or with your team are going to be recommended to you by somebody who did the interview or knows somebody who did. And so we call that the breadcrumb model. And so you're just going to basically be picking up people as you go along, and that will insert some bias, but it will also give you interviews. So there you go. So now, next slide, we are moving on to the interview outline. So this is what I recommend rather than a questions list. The interview outline is basically, you are going to synthesize all of this research and planning that you've done into a list of bulleted and sub-bulleted topics. Might be chronological, might be subject-based, but it's just a list of all of the things that you want to make sure that you cover. And you're going to do this exhaustively, and you're going to do it very thoughtfully. Next slide. And as you create your interview outline, you are going to make sure that the items that you bulleted, or rather, as a whole, it relates to your hard goals and your soft goals. So your hard goal is going to be what are you doing with this this list of recordings? Are you making an archive? Are you going to have a listening party? Is this going to go into a documentary? Is this going to go into some sort of arts or creative work ultimately? Is it for your dissertation? Is it for transcripts? Is it a family heirloom? Which, very valid. A lot of people who do oral history projects also have soft goals, which they want their work to be influential in the community or around the community, because they're trying to make a point, basically. So a soft goal could be, we want to stimulate discussion, we want to build community, we want to do some work around activism, we want to deeper people's understanding or their own personal understanding of an issue, to document, enliven, or augment existing history. So now that you have your hard goals, you have your soft goals, you have your interview outline, you make a schedule of when you're going to do everything, you're going to make a budget, you're going to write a short document that defines your intention, your audience, your top 3 hard and soft goals, list any issues in accessibility, list your narrators. You're going to have, in the old days, it would be stapled, but now it would just be another page on the document. Your different interview outlines, which some people, like for many projects, to be honest, one interview outline works for all of them. Other ones, particularly when you're dealing with very important, specific people, they're going to have their own interview outline. Make sure that you mention your scope, which is how many interviews you're doing, how many people you're interviewing, how long, your budget, and if there are more interviewers than just you, make sure that you list that out. And then, of course, you're just going to do an evaluation. Does the project plan support all the goals that I'm seeking to obtain? So in the interest of time, we are going to skip this breakout session number 1. But I wondered if we might instead have a quick chat and see if there's any more questions or just, thoughts on what we've discussed or questions. Otherwise, we can move on to the next phase, which is doing the actual interview.
I
Yeah,
haven't
let's skip
seen
that.
anything new. Yeah, I haven't seen anything new in the chat so far.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's move to project phase 3. Great, exactly. So at this point, you are contacting your participants. So you are going to send them an introductory letter, and you're also going to send an introduction letter to your advisory council members. I found this on the internet. I tend to be significantly more informal in my communications. It works for me. I also have the sort of luxury of not being attached to a university. So I do think that this is a good letter, though, that you can, sorry, next slide, that you can sort of be inspired by. Next slide. The next thing that you're going to do is get equipment. Now, so as a famous person once said, it's not about the mic. I personally use a Zoom H4n. It's a standard professional level recorder. It was about $600 when I acquired it about 5-7 years ago now. But I did a lot of my most important early interviews on a really cheap Tascam, and the Tascam can record at 16-bit depth and 44.2 hertz sample rate. It doesn't sound as good as the Zoom H4n, but I guess the point I'm making is don't allow budgetary constraints or an inability to get a $600 recorder to dissuade you or to make you shy away from doing the recordings. I have there's a really awesome audio producer who's done a lot of work with This American Life, who I was very lucky to spend some time with some years back. And I asked him what recorder he used, and he showed me his iPhone. And he takes his iPhone and he goes into a closet in his bedroom and he reads his script there, and then he edits based on that. So although there is a great art in finding the exact right microphone for the situation that you're in, I don't recommend for a beginner going down that hole. I would always recommend focusing on your personal audio interview skills. Just focus on getting good as an interviewer. That's what I would say. And at the point that you feel that you are a good enough interviewer and you want to move on and you want to make your recording sound really good, at that point, reach out to me. You can also reach out. It's very easy to find an audio producer who can provide you with recommendations on a recording setup that is specific to the type of interviews that you do. And the reason I say that is it's difficult to recommend recording equipment because it is often specific to the type of recordings that you do. So I was doing recordings in a soup kitchen once, and I was supposed to have my own room, and it didn't end up happening. And I was recording in the actual soup kitchen during the lunch rush. And I had a shotgun mic that I had on my subjects, and it was not great audio. I will not lie to you. But I was able to work with an audio producer who was able to get rid of a lot of the background noise, and the final result, although I do wish there was a little less background noise, it really actually added dimension to the recordings because you can actually hear these people talking and you can hear the sounds of the kitchen and people chatting in the background. So I guess I would say keep an open mind as to what is best and worst. Focus on being a great interviewer. And when you feel that it's time to make an investment or you have money and budget to make an investment in great audio equipment, speak to an audio engineer. You can probably get a great consultation for $150, maybe $250. And to be frank, if you're going to spend the thousands of dollars that it would take to really set yourself up recording wise, that would be a wise investment, is my that is my recommendation. Okay. Okay, next. So now we're going to get, in the last few minutes here, talk about the pre-interview. The pre-interview is very important because this is where you set up the ethical constraints that are going to bind you as the interviewer during the interview itself. So just to read off a few of these, you're obviously going to get their name and contact information. You're going to set up a plan, a time, an appointment for when you're going to do the recording. I always plan to spend 2 hours interviewing, and then plus, honestly, half hour before and after. So for me, it's generally a 3-hour venture. It is exhausting to interview for 2 hours. I would go for 3. I would be very hesitant to go for more than 3. And I would recommend that for a beginner that you start with 45 minutes because it's intense. You're going to be speaking to the narrator about the topics that you would like to discuss. Share with them your interview outline. They might be able to tell you, add this. You forgot that. You might find that they dispute dates or exactly what happened. That's great. In which case, it's fun to actually ask them about that, because there's usually a story about how some people came to believe one thing. And they might also, of course, importantly tell you, I'm not ready to go there, or I don't want to speak about that, in which case you strike it off your list. So a lot of it is just creating a shared understanding of what you're going to talk about. What are the basic facts of what happened? Make sure that nothing's missing, and make sure that that they are comfortable speaking about all the things that you plan to speak about. This is pretty exhaustive, so you can review this on your own. But I would say that I was at an Oral History Association meeting a few years back, and there was a lively discussion about paying your sources for their stories. And you can't frame it that way, because you're first of all, you don't own their story. That would be a very exhaustive process that would involve a lot of lawyers. Secondly, you would be paying them for the time that it takes, and perhaps for the emotional labor that it takes for them to go through the process with you. It is exhausting to be an interviewer, and it is very vulnerable to go through the process of, submitting yourself to these interviews. So it was very controversial at the time, and walking into that meeting, I would have said I don't pay people for interviews, but the person made such a compelling argument about why not. And I realized I'm not a journalist, and if I did have money, I would not hesitate to give a stipend to the folks that are spending this time with me and doing this emotional labor, and signing a release form. So I just wanted to bring that up. And the final thing is, this is very sticky, but you can see this in the sort of lower right hand quadrant. Be aware you may be offended by the way I understand you. This is a sticky thing that also comes up in oral history. And my personal take is that you are not, as a narrator, creating propaganda. You are not only interviewing people that you want to say are, sort of saint-like upholders of all that is good. I believe, for myself, when I'm doing an oral history, my job is to talk about the truth of a person's life. And that always, if they're being thorough and exhaustive, includes some things that they might be ashamed of, they wish they didn't do. God, you're lucky if they're willing to talk about that. That is a huge gift. And when these things happen, or even if they might be proud of some things, it doesn't mean that you have to be proud of them as well. And getting to the truth of it, first of all, you are under no obligation to agree with them. You are under no, I would say it's not your place to be approving or disapproving of them during the oral history interview. But often people ask, do you know what I mean? Or you get it right, or they'll ask for affirmation. You are under no obligation to provide that affirmation. And you should not, if you do not feel it. I would say that it's best to, play Switzerland. But a thing that happens oftentimes in oral history is the participant can have the belief that that you are sort of exalting them, and that by the act of interviewing them, you are affirming everything about their life or everything that you're talking about. And I just don't think that you can do an honest oral history if you are going to enter under those under that belief. And so I think that it's nice to be able to address that ahead of time, and they know that you said that, and if it comes up, there was always informed consent. I'm happy to hear what people have to say about that. It's very sticky, but yeah, I mean, I think oral history is a human thing, and you will meet people just like in life where you're not an advocate of everything that they've done in their life. And that doesn't mean that you can't enjoy interviewing them. That doesn't mean that you can't like certain aspects of who they are. It doesn't mean you can't think that they're a good person who did something wrong. One of the things that I love about oral history is it really requires that we open up to all of the many layers that exist in each and every one of us. And because humans are such social people, we're always searching for the truth and the deeper truth and meaning in it. And I don't know how you can do it more than a few times without running into these issues. And for me, it's something that I always just sit with, and I'm grateful for it because that's a deep experience. Okay, so moving on to the next phase. Let's see. Oh, looks like I duplicated a slide. So we will move on to the next slide. So basically, after you schedule the interviews, you're going to, basically send them emails or give them phone calls and make sure that they know what's going to happen. Also, make sure that they don't wear loud jewelry or loud clothing. Like, so for instance, sometimes some types of polyester or nylon is just really loud. And if you basically any recorder is going to be remarkably strong. I would recommend turning off refrigerators, etc. But it's just every time they move, it's going to crinkle. And when you listen to the tape, it's going to make your skin crawl. So I recommend cotton. Next slide. So this is just some technicalities on doing the actual recording. Obviously, choose a quiet room that doesn't echo. Use the restroom prior to doing the recording. Ask open questions. Follow the flow of the conversation. Be improvisational. Do not verbalize while the interview speaks. This was one that was very difficult for me while I was learning. Because I tend to be affirmational, and I say and first of all, it sounds awful. Second of all, when you're listening to it, you really just want to hear the other person. You really just want to hear the subject speaking their truth in their words, and it's jarring to hear somebody else's conversational tidbits on top of it. But also in a very practical sense, although this doesn't apply to everybody, it's very difficult. You can't edit that out. And so it makes it very difficult to depending on where the crosstalk happens, it makes it impossible to create a totally clean a vignette, a piece of audio poetry out of what they've said. So this is all rather cut and dry. So I'm going to pass to the next slide. So after the interview, just have a chat with them. Ask them how they felt. Ask them what surprised them. It's very common for folks to remember something after the fact. feel free to turn on the recording again and make, track number 2. And also feel free to schedule another interview with them. I can't tell you how many people I've done multiple interviews with because it's fun. And once people realize it's fun, they want to keep doing it. But an important thing that we need to bring up is the consent form. At StoryCorps, we have 2 options. We have signing a release, which means that StoryCorps gets copyright of the interview, or not signing a release, which means that StoryCorps does not get copyright, but we also are unable to pass your interview recording over to the Library of Congress. As an independent oral historian or somebody, who's working on behalf of a smaller, community organization, you're not going to have access to the Library of Congress, really. But you still need to get that consent. Now, consent can cover co-copyright. It can cover full copyright. I am totally legally unprepared to speak about the nuances. I know co-copyright is very nuanced, but you cannot store a person's oral history if you are not a co-creator of it, i.e. another participant, without their permission. You cannot use it without their permission. You cannot archive it without their permission. And you need to have that permission documented. And the way that you do that is via a consent and release form. And my recommendation is, if you're not going to get it at the time, you're going to give them a week. And if you don't get it after a week, don't expect that you're going to get it, because the rate of return really declines precipitously after that point. But I can't overstate it. There's a lawyer who works specifically on oral history. His name is John Neuenschwander. His name is in the slides. So I recommend looking into that. Next slide. Here is some further resources on consent, and here we have Neuenschwander's name. I wouldn't trust myself to spell that without having it written out, so I made sure to do that for you. Next slide. Okay, and then afterwards you are saying thank you. You provide a copy of the interview to participants always. You back up the audio, meaning you make a copy of it. Technically, you make 2 copies of it. And any photos or consent forms, and you create derivative works. Next slide. Now, after this, we're not going to have time to go into this, but I highly recommend that you prepare metadata, which I would recommend doing in an Excel spreadsheet or Google Slides spreadsheet, and also that you follow very strict naming conventions. Next slide. These naming conventions, we have some examples here, will allow you to go into your files and identify the recordings quickly, and also each of the bits of the files that accompany the recordings. That would be the audio file, the metadata spreadsheet, photos, release forms, and anything else that might pertain to it. Like, so for instance, a photo of an award that somebody got, or a PDF of a newspaper clipping, for instance. Next slide. And then metadata, again, a thing that we cannot get into, but what I've listed here is the short list. And frankly, it's exhaustive, and unless you're doing a gigantic, like a very large interview collection process, I would say you don't need more than this. This covers it. This is good. And instead of making more metadata, take this and make it very good. So basically, we have a short description that includes names, ages, dates of birth of all narrators, their relationship, topics of conversations, and keep it short and objective. Include some keywords, some short biographical information, particularly if it's an heirloom family oral history project, subject logs, and a transcript. And it's so easy to get great transcripts these days. And we are going to skip the next breakout session and the final question thing. And I'm going to open up the chat and would love to hear. There should be the next slide, Christina, should say thank you. Thanks. So we have a few minutes. I'd love to hear questions and comments. And thank you all so very much. Okay, I just want to give a shout out to Rizmin, who I hope I'm not butchering this, is doing work with the Smili community. And I don't know if let's see, where is this? Oh, it keeps on going. If you would like to share, Rizwan, that would be fantastic. Everybody, if you could drop links to your projects, I think that would be really awesome.
One of the points that was made earlier and that we as a community project believe in is that we're also resources for each other. So we're very grateful to all of you for coming and participating and for sharing your questions, your comments, and your work. This is how we learn and grow and also get more familiar with different ways that the techniques are being used by projects, and so we can help each other to keep going on. And Kristen has kindly put in the chat some of the links to our upcoming workshops. We have a session this afternoon starting at 3 o'clock by Krista White. She is our digital humanities librarian, an amazing person, and we'll talk about preservation. So as Maria kindly pointed out, it is very important to follow naming conventions for yourself in your project so you can locate things, but what will be specifically discussed is how to make sure the recordings that you're using, the materials you're collecting are properly preserved so that for communities and generations to come, we'll have access to this history. So thank you. I just wanted to give Maria a big round of applause. Thank you so very much for coming and sharing your expertise, and to all of you for your patience as we navigated some technical issues. Today it was such a rich presentation despite that, and we're so encouraged that you're all here with us and continue to include us in your educational spaces and your research. And if there's anything that we can do to help you keep it moving, and we're happy to do that. So with that, thank you again. I also want to give a big shout out to Kristen, who is our chat manager extraordinaire plus event plus. They've also done our podcast. So if you're thinking of different kinds of ways to put that oral history into action, you could check out some of the recordings that they put up for us too. And with that, Betty, if you signed up for the 3 o'clock workshop, you will see the ticket in your inbox. So if you follow that qn.bootcamp.eventbrite.com, you'll see all of our links to the upcoming presentations. Great. Yes, the podcast is also available on iTunes. And another shout out to Dominique Rocker, serving as our social media coordinator. And so please follow us at Queer Newark. We're on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and. And thank you again so very much. If there's anyone that wants to stay a little bit longer, I know, Maria, you probably don't have maybe much time there because we said we'd be finishing at 2 o'clock. But a couple of you that wanted to participate in the breakout session, perhaps again, we can break you out and you could work on asking each other some of those questions if you'd like. So with that, are there any? Happy to stay on? Okay, Kristen. Okay. Oh, great. Podcast on Nola Dyke bars, queer resistance. All right. Thank you, Natalie. Absolutely. We're all so blown away by Maria, the structure and her process, because she was one of our very first facilitators when we did our in-person boot camp. And we had so many great feedback and so many requests to have this again. So of course, Maria was first and forefront of our minds when we went virtual.